6 months after Thomas first sent his grandson's drone into the crater, the excavation had evolved from a frantic discovery phase into a methodical long-term archaeological project. The world's initial frenzy had calmed into sustained interest. The media circus had packed up, though a core group of journalists remained, filing regular updates about new findings. Thomas's farm had found a new rhythm, one that balanced ongoing scientific work with the reality of still being a working cattle ranch. The chamber itself had been transformed into a proper archaeological site. Engineers had reinforced the crater walls and installed a permanent access system with stairs and a lift. Climate control equipment maintained stable temperature and humidity to preserve the artifacts. The boat, still in its original position, was now protected by a clear containment structure that let researchers work while preventing any contamination. Dr. Chen had effectively moved to Montana, setting up a semi-permanent research station on Thomas's property. On any given day, there might be 20 or 30 scientists working in and around the chamber, each focused on their specialty. Bone specialists analyzing the remains, wood experts studying the boat's construction, textile researchers examining fragments of preserved clothing. Every day brought new insights into how these Norse settlers had lived and died. One morning in early spring, Thomas got a call from Dr. Walsh. "Can you come to the chamber? We've found something remarkable." Thomas made the now familiar descent into the chamber, where Dr. Walsh was waiting with barely contained excitement. She led him to a section of wall that had recently been cleared of debris. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of carvings. "We thought we'd translated all the major inscriptions, but this section was hidden behind a collapsed stone shelf. It's a journal of sorts written over the 3 years they were trapped here." Over the next several weeks, Dr. Walsh worked on translating the newly discovered text. What emerged was an incredibly detailed account of daily life in the sealed chamber. The writer, who identified herself as Sigrid, had recorded everything with remarkable clarity. How they rationed their supplies, how they kept track of time by marking days on the wall, how they maintained hope even as their situation became increasingly desperate. But it was the personal details that truly brought the story to life. Sigrid wrote about her daughter Astrid, who'd been 6 years old when they were trapped. She described teaching the child songs and stories to keep her spirits up. She wrote about her husband Bjorn, who'd never stopped trying to dig through the collapsed entrance, working until his hands bled. She recorded the deaths one by one and how the survivors honored each person. The most heartbreaking entries came from near the end. By the 3rd year, Sigrid was alone. She wrote about talking to the darkness, singing the songs her mother had taught her, trying to remember the smell of rain and the feel of wind. Her final entries were brief. She was weak, she was ready, but she wanted to leave a record so that their story wouldn't be lost forever. "She got her wish," Thomas said quietly, after Dr. Walsh read him the translations. "We found them. We're telling their story. More than that," Dr. Walsh replied. Her account is one of the most detailed first-hand records of Viking daily life we've ever discovered. Most of what we know comes from sagas and second-hand accounts. This is direct, unfiltered, written in the moment. It's an incredible historical resource. The academic papers started flowing from the discovery. Dozens of researchers published findings based on the chamber's contents. A journal article about the boat's construction techniques won a major archaeology prize. A paper analyzing the preserved food remains revolutionized understanding of Norse diet and preservation methods. Another study examining the tool marks on the collapsed entrance led to new insights about Viking mining and excavation techniques. But the discovery's impact went beyond academia. The story of the trapped settlers resonated with people worldwide. A Norwegian author wrote a best-selling novel based on Sigrid's journal entries. A documentary about the excavation won an Emmy. Schools around the world added the discovery to their curricula, using it as a jumping-off point to discuss Norse exploration, archaeological methods, and the human capacity for hope in desperate circumstances. Thomas watched it all with a mixture of pride and bemusement. He was still just a cattle farmer, but somehow he'd become part of something much larger. He gave occasional interviews, always emphasizing that the discovery wasn't about him. It was about the people who'd lived and died in that chamber. It was about giving voice to forgotten history. The question of what to do with the site long-term became a major discussion. The Smithsonian wanted to eventually remove the artifacts for preservation and display. The Norwegian government offered to fund a museum on Thomas's property. Local officials saw tourism potential. Environmental groups worried about the impact on the land. Everyone had an opinion. Thomas and Helen spent long evenings discussing the options. They could sell the property to the state and retire comfortably. They could partner with museums and universities. They could keep ownership and turn it into a private attraction. Every choice had implications. In the end, they chose a middle path. They donated the chamber and the surrounding acres to a foundation created specifically to preserve and study the site. The foundation was governed jointly by the Smithsonian, the Norwegian National Museum, Montana State University, and representatives from local indigenous tribes. Thomas remained on the board as a voting member. The land would stay protected. The research would continue. And someday, when the excavation was complete, the public would be able to visit and learn the story firsthand. "We're custodians, not owners," Thomas explained at the press conference announcing the decision. "This discovery belongs to everyone. Our job is to make sure it's preserved properly and that the story reaches as many people as possible." As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, plans were made for a memorial ceremony. The Norwegian government sent representatives. Descendants of Norse families who'd researched their genealogy and believed they might be related made the journey. Indigenous leaders from regional tribes came to pay respects and discuss the historical context of Norse interaction with their ancestors. The ceremony was held at sunset, with attendees gathering around the crater. Dr. Chen spoke about the archaeological significance. A Norwegian official spoke about the courage of the explorers. An elder from the Blackfeet Nation spoke about the importance of understanding all aspects of the region's history. And Thomas, who'd never been comfortable with public speaking, said a few words about the randomness of discovery and the responsibility it brings. But the most powerful moment came when a children's choir from Oslo sang traditional Norwegian songs. The music drifted down into the chamber where Sigrid and her family had spent their final years. It felt like the completion of a circle, like somehow the sound reached back through time to tell those long-dead settlers that they hadn't been forgotten, that their story lived on. In the months that followed, the excavation work continued at a slower, more sustainable pace. The initial rush to document everything had given way to careful, methodical study. Some researchers had moved on to other projects, but a core team remained, working year-round to extract every possible bit of information from the site. New discoveries still occurred regularly. A cache of preserved seeds was found, leading to a study about what crops the settlers had hoped to plant. Personal jewelry revealed clues about their origins and social status. Even mundane items like cooking pots and eating utensils provided insights into daily life. Thomas made it a habit to descend into the chamber once a month, just to sit quietly and think. The space had become familiar to him now. He knew where each artifact had been found. He could walk from the boat to the living area to the collapsed entrance in complete darkness if needed. Sometimes Dr. Chen or other researchers would be working when he visited, but often he was alone with his thoughts. On one such visit, almost 18 months after the initial discovery, Thomas stood in front of the wall where Sigrid had carved her final messages. He thought about her courage, facing death alone in the darkness but still taking the time to record what happened. He thought about the randomness of it all. If the crater had opened a year earlier or later, he might have missed it. If he'd never learned to fly that drone, the chamber might have sat undiscovered for another century. "Thank you," he said quietly to the empty chamber. "Thank you for leaving your story for us to find." The sound of his voice echoed off the stone walls before fading into silence. Thomas stood there for a few more moments, then headed back to the surface. Life on the farm had changed in ways both large and small. The south pasture would never be used for grazing again. The daily routine now included checking in with the research team. Visitors occasionally stopped by, hoping for a glimpse of the famous crater. But in many ways, things remained the same. The cows still needed feeding. Fences still needed mending. The land still required care and attention. Helen had embraced their new role with unexpected enthusiasm. She'd started giving tours to school groups, telling the story of the discovery and what it meant. She'd learned enough about Norse history to answer most questions. The kids loved her, and she loved sharing the story with young people who might be inspired to become archaeologists or historians themselves. Thomas's grandson Bobby visited frequently, proud that his Christmas gift had played a role in the discovery. He'd upgraded to a newer drone and often helped the research team with aerial photography and site mapping. "Grandpa," he said during one visit, "do you ever think about what else might be out there? What other discoveries are just waiting to be found?" Thomas looked out across his land, the fields and pastures he'd known his entire life. "All the time," he admitted. "It makes you realize how much we don't know about the past. How many stories are still buried, waiting for someone to stumble across them." As the 2-year anniversary approached, the major excavation phase was winding down. Most of the artifacts had been documented and carefully removed for preservation. The chamber itself would remain largely intact, preserved as a historical site. Plans for the public museum were moving forward, with construction scheduled to begin the following spring. Dr. Chen announced he was writing a comprehensive book about the discovery and the excavation process. He'd asked Thomas to write the foreword. "You started this," Dr. Chen said. "Your curiosity and willingness to investigate changed everything. That deserves to be acknowledged." Thomas tried to decline, feeling unworthy of such a responsibility, but Helen encouraged him. "Tell people what it was like," she said. "Not the science part. The human part. What it felt like to look at that drone footage and realize you'd found something incredible. What it felt like to know people were down there, waiting to have their story told." So Thomas wrote his piece, working on it over several weeks until he felt he'd captured the experience properly. He wrote about that first morning when the crater appeared, about learning to fly the drone with Bobby's help, about the moment the carved stones appeared on his screen, about the responsibility of discovery and the privilege of being part of something larger than himself. On the anniversary, at a ceremony much smaller and more intimate than the previous year's event, Dr. Chen read Thomas's foreword aloud. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Thomas had managed to capture something essential about the discovery, something that transcended academic papers and historical significance. He'd written about connection, about how the past and present can touch across centuries, and about how sometimes the most important discoveries come from simply being curious enough to look. Years from now, Thomas knew, long after he was gone, people would still be studying the chamber. New technologies would reveal details they couldn't see today. New theories would emerge about how the settlers got there and what their presence meant. The story would continue to evolve. But for Thomas, the most important part was already complete. He'd found them. He'd made sure their story was told. Sigrid's hope that someone would find them someday and know what happened had been fulfilled. On quiet evenings, sitting on his porch with Helen, watching the sun set over the land his family had worked for generations, Thomas sometimes thought about the strange path his life had taken. One moment of curiosity had led to all of this. One decision to send a drone into a crater had connected him to people who'd died 1,000 years ago. "Any regrets?" Helen asked him once, echoing the question she'd posed in the early days of the discovery. Thomas thought about his quiet life before the crater. The simple rhythms of farming, the peaceful obscurity, all of that was gone now. His name was in history books. His farm was famous. His life had been irrevocably changed. "No," he said finally, "no regrets. Those people deserve to have their story told. If I had to lose my quiet life to make that happen, it was worth it." He looked out at the crater, now illuminated by spotlights as researchers worked into the evening. Somewhere down there in that chamber carved from stone was the boat that had carried families across an ocean and up into an unknown continent. There were the walls where Sigrid had recorded her final thoughts. There was the physical evidence of courage, hope, and human perseverance in the face of impossible odds, and there, at the edge of the crater, was Thomas Whitaker, a Montana cattle farmer who'd stumbled into history and chosen to honor it properly. His legacy would be forever linked to theirs, the discoverer and the discovered, connected across time by a crater in a Montana pasture, and a story that deserved to be told. 2 weeks after the first archaeological team descended into the chamber, the real excavation began in earnest. Thomas's south pasture had been transformed into something resembling a small city. White tents dotted the landscape. Generator-powered lights ran 24 hours a day. Scientists from 12 different countries had arrived, each bringing specialized equipment and expertise. The media presence had settled into a permanent fixture. A designated press area had been established at the edge of Thomas's property. where reporters could film without interfering with the work. Twice a day, Dr. Chen or another team leader would give brief updates. The whole world was watching, waiting to learn the secrets hidden beneath Montana soil. Thomas had been given a special access pass that let him come and go as he pleased. Most mornings, he'd wake up early and drive out to watch the work. The operation fascinated him. Teams would descend into the crater on secure climbing systems, spending hours documenting every inch of the chamber. Everything was photographed, measured, and cataloged before anyone touched it. The boat itself had become the center of attention. Wood samples had been carefully extracted and sent to 3 different laboratories for carbon dating. The results came back consistent across all 3 tests. The wood was approximately 1,021 years old, give or take 30 years. That placed its construction around the year 1000 CE, right in the heart of the Viking Age. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the runes expert, had set up a workstation in one of the larger tents. She'd been studying high-resolution photographs of the carved symbols on the chamber walls for days. When Thomas visited her tent one morning, he found her surrounded by books, notes, and computer screens covered in strange letters. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, barely looking up from her work, "you have impeccable timing. I was just about to call Dr. Chen. I've made a breakthrough with the translation." "You can read it?" Thomas asked, pulling up a chair. "Most of it, yes. Old Norse isn't my primary specialty, but I've been consulting with colleagues in Oslo and Reykjavik. The writing is crude, clearly done by someone who wasn't a professional scribe, but the message is readable." She pulled out a photograph of one wall section. "This here tells us who they were. A group of explorers from Norway, led by a man whose name translates roughly to Thorstein. They left Norway in the year 1018. Thomas leaned forward, studying the ancient writing. "Why did they come here?" "That's where it gets interesting. According to these inscriptions, they weren't exploring. They were fleeing. There was some kind of conflict back home. Political, probably. Several families decided to leave and seek new lands in the West. They'd heard stories of Leif Erikson's voyages to Vinland, so they knew land existed across the ocean." Over the next few days, Dr. Walsh pieced together more of the story from the runic inscriptions. The Norwegian refugees had sailed west and established a small settlement on the coast of what was now Canada. They'd lived there for several years, trading occasionally with indigenous peoples. But conflicts arose. The runes weren't specific about the details, but it was clear the Norse settlers found themselves unwelcome. "This part is fascinating," Dr. Walsh told Thomas during one of his visits. They described discovering a river system that led inland. Several of the younger men in their group wanted to explore it, to find a place where they could settle away from the coast. According to this, they spent months traveling upstream, portaging around rapids, dragging their boat through shallow waters. "They brought the boat all the way here?" Thomas asked, incredulous. "Apparently so. Or they built a new one along the way using the old one as a template. We're still debating that. But yes, somehow this group of Norse settlers made it deep into the interior of North America, following river systems that would eventually lead them to this area." The story got more remarkable as Dr. Walsh translated more sections. The Norse group had discovered the cave system by accident. One of their members had fallen through a thin spot in the ground, much like Thomas's crater had formed. When they explored below, they found the massive chamber and decided it could serve as a refuge. They brought their boat down somehow, though the inscriptions weren't clear on the exact method. They built living quarters. They stored supplies. They prepared to wait out the winter. But they never left, Thomas said, understanding where this was going. Dr. Walsh nodded sadly. "The final inscriptions we found so far suggest they were trapped. There was an earthquake not uncommon in this region. The entrance they'd been using collapsed. They tried to dig out, but the passage had completely caved in. They were sealed inside. Meanwhile, other teams were making discoveries of their own. The artifacts scattered around the chamber told a story of daily life. Cooking pots, tools for working leather and wood, fishing equipment, even what appeared to be children's toys. This hadn't been just an exploration party. These were families trying to build a new life. The human remains found in the chamber were treated with utmost respect. Forensic anthropologists examined them carefully, trying to determine age, sex, and cause of death. Preliminary analysis suggested there had been approximately 15 people in the chamber when it was sealed. Men, women, and children. They'd survived for some time after being trapped. based on evidence of continued activity and the consumption of stored supplies. Dr. Chen called a major press conference 3 weeks into the excavation. Thomas stood in the back of the tent as cameras from around the world recorded the announcement. What we've discovered in this chamber represents one of the most significant archaeological finds in North American history, Dr. Chen began. We have definitive proof that Norse explorers reached the interior of the continent nearly 1,000 years ago, centuries before any previously documented European contact with this region. He went on to detail the findings, the carbon dating results, the translated runes, the artifacts that unmistakably pointed to Scandinavian origin. This changes our understanding of Viking exploration, he said. We knew they reached the coast. We had hints they might have explored inland. But this proves they traveled extraordinary distances into the continent, adapting their seafaring culture to navigate river systems and survive in completely foreign territory. The announcement made headlines worldwide. Academic journals rushed to publish papers about the discovery. History textbooks would need to be revised. School curricula would need to be updated. The traditional narrative of American exploration was being rewritten in real time. But Thomas found himself more interested in the human story than the historical significance. These weren't just artifacts and data points. These were people who'd taken an incredible risk, sailing across an ocean to escape conflict and build something new. They'd adapted, persevered, and pushed into unknown territory. And ultimately, they'd been trapped by circumstances beyond their control. One evening, Thomas was allowed to descend into the chamber himself. Wearing a harness and hard hat, guided by experienced climbers, he made the long descent into the darkness. Standing in the chamber for the first time, surrounded by artifacts 1,000 years old, he felt a profound connection to the people who'd lived and died here. The boat dominated the space, its curved lines still graceful after a millennium in darkness. Thomas walked around it slowly, his headlamp illuminating carved decorations on the wood. He could see places where tools had been stored, where supplies had been stacked. He could almost imagine the families who'd sheltered here, hoping for rescue that never came. It's something, isn't it? Dr. Chen's voice came from behind him. He'd descended into the chamber as well. All these years they were down here. Generations of your family walked above never knowing. Why didn't they make more noise? Thomas asked. If they were trapped, why didn't they bang on the ceiling or something? Someone might have heard. The limestone is too thick. And remember, this was 1021 CE. The nearest indigenous settlements were probably miles away. The area was far less populated then. They were completely isolated. Dr. Chen paused. We found something today, Thomas. I wanted to tell you first before we announce it publicly. He led Thomas to the far wall of the chamber, where recent excavation work had revealed a section of carved text that had been partially buried under debris. Dr. Walsh had translated it that afternoon. It's a final message, Dr. Chen explained. Written by the last survivor, a young woman named Sigrid based on the name carved here. She recorded the names of everyone who'd been with her, what happened to them, and how long they'd survived after being trapped. Thomas read the translation Dr. Chen handed him. The writing was matter-of-fact, almost clinical as Sigrid described their deteriorating situation. Food running out, water sources drying up, people getting sick. She'd been the last one alive, and she'd used her final strength to carve this record. Not a plea for help, not anger at their fate, just a simple statement of what had happened so that if anyone ever found them, they would know the truth. The date she carved at the end, Dr. Chen said quietly, translates to approximately 3 years after the earthquake sealed them in. They survived down here for 3 years before the last person died. Thomas felt tears in his eyes. These people had been farmers like him. They'd worked the land, raised families, hoped for better futures. And they'd ended up here in the darkness trying to survive until the very end. Over the following weeks, more details emerged. Analysis of the stored food remains showed they'd been incredibly resourceful, rationing carefully and even attempting to grow mushrooms in the chamber's darkness. Tool marks on the collapsed entrance showed they'd never given up trying to dig their way out. Personal items found near the remains suggested families had stayed together even in death. The discovery captured the world's imagination, but for different reasons than Thomas expected. Yes, the historical significance was huge. Yes, it rewrote the textbooks. But what really resonated with people was the human story. These weren't faceless historical figures. They were real people who'd faced unimaginable circumstances with courage and dignity. Letters started arriving at Thomas's farm, thousands of them. From school children studying the discovery, from descendants of Norwegian families wondering if they might be related, from people who just wanted to express how much the story moved them. Thomas and Helen spent evenings reading them, touched by how much the discovery meant to others. One letter came from Oslo, Norway, from an elderly woman who'd researched her family tree. Based on the names carved in the chamber, she believed she might be descended from Thorstein's family, from relatives who'd stayed behind in Norway. She wanted to visit, to pay her respects to the ancestors who'd died so far from home. Thomas wrote back immediately, inviting her to come. When she arrived 6 weeks later, he accompanied her on the descent into the chamber. She stood before the carved names, tears streaming down her face, speaking softly in Norwegian. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the emotion. She was saying goodbye to family members who died 1,000 years ago, finally giving them the acknowledgement they'd never received. That evening, as the Norwegian woman flew home and the excavation work continued under floodlights, Thomas sat on his porch with Helen. "Did we do the right thing?" he asked, disturbing their rest, making them famous. Helen took his hand. "You gave them a voice. For 1,000 years nobody knew they existed. Their courage, their journey, their sacrifice, all of it was lost in the darkness. Now the whole world knows their story." "That seems right to me." Thomas hoped she was correct. The people in that chamber had carved their names into stone, had left a record of their existence. Maybe in their final days they'd hoped someone would find it eventually. Now someone had. And their story, after a millennium of silence, was finally being told. Thomas didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that boat sitting in the chamber below his pasture. Helen was restless too, tossing and turning beside him. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely and went downstairs to make coffee. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, watching the drone footage again and again. In the quiet of the night, the whole thing felt unreal. Like maybe he'd dreamed it all, but the video didn't lie. That boat was down there. Those carvings were real. Whatever story that chamber held, it was waiting to be told. His phone buzzed at 6:30. It was Frank. "You up?" "Never really went to sleep," Thomas admitted. "Good," my brother-in-law called back. "He's bringing a team out this afternoon. Just a preliminary look, but he says if the footage is accurate, we're sitting on something massive. He also suggested we keep things quiet for now. The last thing we need is treasure hunters showing up before the site is properly secured." Thomas agreed, though part of him wondered if keeping quiet was even possible anymore. News had a way of spreading in small towns, and Frank's daughter Rachel had seen the footage. So had Helen. How long before someone mentioned it to someone else? The answer, it turned out, was not long at all. By noon, Thomas's phone was ringing constantly. The local newspaper wanted an interview. The county commissioner wanted to know what was going on. Even the mayor called asking if the rumors were true. Thomas ignored most of the calls, but word was definitely spreading. Frank's brother-in-law arrived at 2 o'clock with 3 other professors from the university. Dr. Raymond. Chen was a short man with thick glasses and an energy that reminded Thomas of a kid on Christmas morning. He practically ran from his car to the crater's edge. "Show me everything," Dr. Chen said. "Every bit of footage you have." They set up in Thomas's living room with the professors crowded around the laptop. Thomas played the full recording of their descent into the chamber. The academics were silent throughout, but their expressions spoke volumes. Shock, disbelief, excitement. When the boat appeared on screen, one of the professors actually gasped. "It's real," Dr. Chen said, more to himself than anyone else. "It's actually real. I didn't want to believe it when Frank described it, but it's real." "What is it?" Thomas asked. "What are we looking at?" Dr. Chen rewound the footage to a clear shot of the boat. "If I'm right, and I really hope I'm not wrong, this is a Norse vessel. Viking age, probably 10th or 11th century. The design is consistent with exploration ships from that era. But Thomas, do you understand what this means? We're in Montana. We're nearly 1,000 miles from the ocean. Vikings aren't supposed to have been anywhere near here." One of the other professors, a woman named Dr. Patricia Walsh, leaned forward. "Look at those symbols on the walls." "Can you zoom in?" Thomas did. "Those are runes. Old Norse writing. I'd need better images to translate them, but this is definitely Scandinavian in origin. But how? Helen asked. How does a Viking ship end up in a cave in Montana? That's what we need to find out, Dr. Chen said. But first, we need to secure this site properly. We need to do a safe descent, document everything in detail, and most importantly, we need to keep this quiet until we know what we're dealing with. If word gets out prematurely, we'll have every treasure hunter and conspiracy theorist in the country trying to break into that chamber. Thomas nodded, but he could see the irony in Dr. Chen's words even as he said them. Keep it quiet? With this many people knowing? It was only a matter of time. That night, despite everyone's best intentions, someone posted something online. Thomas never found out exactly who. Maybe it was one of the professors, excited to share the news with a colleague. Maybe it was Rachel at Frank's office mentioning it to a friend. Maybe it was someone who'd overheard a conversation at the local diner. It didn't really matter. By midnight, the story was out there. Viking ship discovered in Montana cave, read one headline. Farmer makes discovery that could rewrite American history, said another. The posts were mostly on archaeology forums and historical websites at first. Nobody paid much attention. It sounded too crazy to be true. But then someone shared the drone footage. Thomas woke up Thursday morning to find his video had been viewed 15,000 times. By lunch, it was 50,000. By dinner, it had passed 200,000. The views kept climbing. 1 million. 2 million. 5 million! By Friday morning, Thomas's quiet drone footage had been watched by 15 million people worldwide. That's when the news vans started arriving. The first one showed up at 7 in the morning. By noon, there were 12 satellite trucks parked along the road leading to Thomas's property. Reporters stood in his driveway doing live broadcasts. Helicopters circled overhead, trying to get aerial shots of the crater. This is insane, Helen said, watching from the living room window as another news van pulled up. How did this happen so fast? Thomas didn't have an answer. He'd spent his whole life trying to avoid attention, and now the eyes of the world were pointed directly at his farm. His phone had basically become useless, flooded with calls and messages from reporters, documentary producers, book publishers, and people claiming to be historians or experts who wanted to see the site. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived mid-morning with half the county's police force. We need to set up a perimeter, he told Thomas. For your protection and for the site's protection. We've already had 3 separate groups trying to sneak onto your property. One guy had climbing gear and was planning to rappel down into the crater. By Friday afternoon, Thomas's farm looked like a military base. Police barriers blocked all the access roads. Officers checked credentials before letting anyone through. The only people allowed near the crater were the official archaeological team, which had grown to include specialists from 5 different universities, 2 museums, and the State Historical Society. Dr. Chen set up a command tent near the crater, coordinating what had become a full-scale expedition. We need to go down there, he told Thomas. The drone footage is incredible, but we need physical access. We need to collect samples, document everything properly, and figure out exactly what we're dealing with. Is that safe? Thomas asked. The ground already collapsed once. What if the rest caves in? We've brought in structural engineers, Dr. Chen assured him. They'll assess the stability before anyone goes down. But Thomas, I need you to understand something. This discovery is going to change your life. It's going to change a lot of lives. What you found down there isn't just a historical curiosity. It's evidence that could fundamentally alter our understanding of pre-Columbian America. The media attention intensified over the weekend. Major networks were now covering the story. CNN had a special segment. The BBC sent a crew from London. Thomas gave exactly one interview to a local reporter he'd known for years, and then refused all other requests. But that didn't stop the speculation. Online forums exploded with theories. Some people claimed it was proof of ancient alien visitation. Others said it was an elaborate hoax. Archaeological experts wrote long articles about Norse exploration of North America, citing evidence from L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland as proof that Vikings had reached the continent. But this was different. This was so far inland. This challenged everything they thought they knew. Social media was even worse. Thomas didn't have accounts on any platforms, but his grandkids showed him what people were saying. Most of it was supportive or excited, but there were angry voices too. People claiming he was destroying evidence or hiding something. Conspiracy theorists saying the government was going to cover it all up. It was overwhelming. On Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Thomas first sent his grandson's drone into the crater, representatives from the Smithsonian Institution arrived. They came with funding, equipment, and official backing from the federal government. Dr. Chen's makeshift operation suddenly became something much more formal. Mr. Whitaker, the lead Smithsonian representative, said, shaking Thomas's hand, "What you've discovered here is unprecedented. We'd like to partner with you on a proper excavation and documentation of the site. This will take time, probably years, but we promise to respect your property rights and keep you involved every step of the way." Thomas looked at Helen. They'd talked about this for hours over the weekend. Their quiet life was gone either way. They could fight it, or they could embrace it and try to do something good. "What do you need from me?" Thomas asked. Over the next few days, the real work began. A team of engineers rappelled down into the crater, setting up safety systems and assessing structural integrity. They confirmed what the initial surveys suggested. The chamber was stable, carved out of solid limestone that had been there for millions of years. The crater itself had formed when a thin layer of topsoil finally gave way, but the chamber below was sound. The first team of archaeologists made the descent on Thursday. Thomas watched from above as they disappeared into the darkness, their helmet lights getting smaller and smaller. Hours passed. Thomas paced back and forth, drinking coffee and worrying. What if something went wrong? What if the chamber wasn't as stable as they thought? When the team finally emerged late in the afternoon, their faces said everything. They'd seen it up close. They'd touched the boat. They'd examined the artifacts. And they'd confirmed what the drone footage suggested. This was real. This was significant. This was going to change history books. Dr. Chen came straight to Thomas, still wearing his climbing harness. "We need to carbon date everything, but based on what we're seeing, that boat is approximately 1,000 years old. The artifacts around it are consistent with Norse origin. And Thomas, there's something else. We found preserved documents, leather pages with runic writing. If we can translate them, they might tell us exactly what happened down there." That evening, as the sun set over his pasture, Thomas stood at the edge of the crater. The activity had died down for the day. Most of the researchers had gone back to their hotels in town. The media vans were still there, of course, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky, ready to broadcast the next development. Helen came and stood beside him, taking his hand. "Any regrets?" she asked. Thomas thought about it. His peaceful life was gone. His farm was now an archaeological site. His name would be in history books. None of that was what he'd wanted when he woke up that Tuesday morning and decided to check on his cows. But as he looked at the crater, at the lights set up around it, at the careful work being done to preserve and understand what lay below, he felt something unexpected. Pride. Whatever story that chamber held, whatever journey had led that Viking boat to rest beneath Montana soil, it was worth telling. And somehow, impossibly, he was the one who got to help tell it. Thomas stared at his controller screen, not quite believing what he was seeing. The drone's camera showed stone blocks fitted together with precision, covered in strange markings that definitely weren't natural. His first instinct was to bring the drone back up immediately and call someone. His second instinct was to keep going deeper. Curiosity won. He pushed the joystick down, sending the drone further into the darkness. The carved walls continued for another 10 feet before the natural limestone resumed. Thomas recorded everything, his thumb shaking slightly as he tried to keep the drone steady. When the battery warning flashed on his screen, he reluctantly brought the drone back up. The flight back seemed to take forever. When the drone finally emerged from the crater and landed safely on his truck tailgate, Thomas immediately pulled out the memory card and plugged it into his phone, using an adapter Bobby had included in the kit. The footage was clear enough even on his small screen. Those stones were definitely carved. This wasn't his imagination. He sat in his truck for a long time just thinking. The smart thing would be to call the sheriff or the county inspector. Show them the footage and let the professionals handle it. But something made him hesitate. What if they dismissed it? What if they said the shadows were playing tricks? Or that he'd just seen some natural rock formation? He needed better footage first. He needed to go deeper. The problem was the drone itself. It was a nice consumer model, perfect for taking aerial shots of the farm or filming Bobby's soccer games. But it wasn't designed for deep cave exploration. The battery only lasted about 20 minutes, and he'd used most of that just getting down to 80 feet and back up. If there was more down there, he'd need something better. Thomas drove into town, his mind made up. He knew exactly where to go. Mitchell Surveying and Engineering had an office on Main Street. He'd gone to high school with the owner, Frank Mitchell, and their company did land surveys all over the county. If anyone had industrial-grade drones, it would be them. The bell above the door chimed as Thomas walked in. Frank's daughter Rachel was at the front desk. She looked up from her computer and smiled. "Mr. Whitaker, what brings you in? Need a property survey?" "Actually, I need to borrow a drone," Thomas said. "A good one. One that can go deep and has strong lights." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "We don't usually loan out equipment, but let me get my dad." Frank came out from the back office, wiping dust off his hands. "Thomas, heard you had some excitement out at your place. Big sinkhole, right? That's what I need the drone for," Thomas said. He pulled out his phone and showed Frank the footage from that morning. "I sent my little consumer drone down there and found this. I need something better to see what else is down there." Frank took the phone and watched the video twice. His expression grew more serious with each viewing. "Thomas, if this is real, you need to call the state geology office. This isn't just a sinkhole, I know, but they already said they won't be out until next week. I just want to know what I'm dealing with before a bunch of government people show up and take over my property." Frank understood that reasoning. Farmers tended to be cautious about government involvement in anything related to their land. "All right, we've got a commercial inspection drone that might work. It's got a 2-hour battery life and industrial LED arrays. We use it for bridge inspections and deep structure surveys, but if you damage it, you're buying me a new one. These things cost 15 grand. Deal," Thomas said immediately. They spent the next hour at Frank's office while he showed Thomas how to operate the bigger drone. It was more complex than Bobby's consumer model, but the basics were similar. The main difference was the battery life and the much brighter lights. Frank also gave him a laptop so he could see the footage on a bigger screen in real time. "One more thing," Frank said as Thomas was packing up the equipment. "I'm coming with you. If there's really something down there, I want to see it too. Plus, someone needs to make sure you don't crash my expensive equipment." Thomas didn't argue. Having a witness might actually be helpful. They loaded everything into Thomas's truck and headed back to the farm. By the time they arrived, it was early afternoon. The crater sat there in the middle of the pasture, waiting. Frank set up the laptop on the truck's hood while Thomas prepared the drone for flight. Helen had come out to see what was happening, and she brought thermoses of coffee and sandwiches. "You boys planning to be out here all day?" she asked. "Maybe," Thomas said. "Depends on what we find." The professional drone was heavier and louder than Bobby's model, but it handled much better in the air. Thomas got it positioned over the crater while Frank monitored the laptop screen. "All right," Frank said. "Let's see what you found." The descent began. The drone's powerful lights illuminated the crater walls much better than before. They could see every detail of the soil layers, every rock, every root. At 50 feet, Frank started taking detailed notes. At 70 feet, he went quiet. At 80 feet, the carved stones appeared again on the screen. "Hold it there," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas, zoom in on those markings." Thomas adjusted the camera. The markings became clearer. They were definitely intentional, definitely carved by hand. Geometric patterns that repeated in a specific sequence. Symbols that looked almost like letters, but not from any alphabet Thomas recognized. "Keep going," Frank said. "We need to see how far this goes." Below the carved section, the natural limestone resumed for a while. 90 feet. 100 feet. 110 feet. Thomas was starting to think that carved section had been just a strange anomaly, when the drone's lights suddenly illuminated something different. The crater opened up. The narrow shaft they'd been descending suddenly widened into a much larger space. Thomas pulled the drone to a hover and slowly rotated it, letting the camera sweep the area. The screen showed what looked like a massive underground chamber. "Are you seeing this?" Thomas whispered. "I'm seeing it, but I don't believe it," Frank replied. His fingers were flying across the laptop keyboard, saving screenshots and recordings. "That chamber has to be at least 100 feet across. Maybe more. How deep are we now?" Thomas checked the altitude reading. 120 feet. Go lower. We need to see what's down there." The drone descended into the chamber, its light sweeping back and forth. The walls were covered with more of those carved symbols. But it was what sat in the center of the chamber that made both men go completely silent. A wooden structure, long and narrow with a distinctive curved shape that tapered at both ends. It sat on a raised stone platform, surrounded by smaller objects that might have been tools or supplies. The wood looked impossibly well preserved for something that was clearly very, very old. "Is that what I think it is?" Helen's voice came from behind them. She'd been watching over their shoulders. "If I had to guess," Frank said slowly, "I'd say that's a boat. A really old boat. Viking style from the shape of it." Thomas brought the drone closer, carefully maneuvering around the ancient vessel. The camera picked up incredible detail. Carved wooden posts at each end, what looked like shields along the sides, and near the boat scattered across the stone floor were other objects. Some looked like weapons, some looked like tools, and some, Thomas realized with a chill, looked like human remains. They spent the next hour documenting everything. Frank directed Thomas to fly a systematic pattern, capturing footage from every angle. The chamber was enormous, roughly 200 feet in diameter. The ceiling was natural rock, but someone had clearly worked to enlarge and shape the space. Multiple passages led off from the main chamber, though they were too narrow for the drone to explore safely. "We need to bring the drone back up," Frank finally said. "The battery's getting low and we've got plenty of footage. More than enough to show people that this is real." Thomas nodded and began the ascent. The journey back up seemed to take forever. Every foot of altitude gained felt like a victory. When the drone finally emerged from the crater into the afternoon sunlight, Thomas let out a huge breath of relief. His hands were cramping from gripping the controller so tightly. Frank was already on his phone, scrolling through contacts. "Thomas, I need to call some people. This is beyond anything I've ever seen. We're talking about a major archaeological discovery here. Maybe the biggest in Montana history. Hell, maybe one of the biggest in American history." "Who are you calling?" Thomas asked. "My brother-in-law teaches archaeology at the state university. If anyone will know what to do with this, it's him. But first, we need to secure this footage. Make copies. Store them in different places. This is going to be important." Helen was still staring at the laptop screen, which showed a paused frame of the wooden boat in the chamber. "How did that get down there?" she asked. "We're hundreds of miles from any ocean. Who would build a boat in an underground cave in Montana? That's the million-dollar question," Frank said. "But based on the style, that boat is probably 1,000 years old. Maybe more, which means people were here, deep in the American interior, centuries before Columbus, centuries before anyone thought Europeans had reached this continent." Thomas sat down on his truck's tailgate, suddenly feeling exhausted. This morning he'd woken up as a simple cattle farmer. Now he was sitting on what might be one of the most important historical discoveries ever made. He thought about his grandfather who'd worked this same land. His father who'd walked across this pasture 1,000 times. None of them had ever suspected what lay beneath their feet. "What happens now?" Thomas asked.